Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast. I'm Gemma Creagh, and in this episode we talk with Mary McGuckian about her latest film, A Girl From Mogadishu. This is a powerful and inspiring film, and it's based on the true story of the global gender-based violence activist Ifrah Ahmed. We began by talking about how Mary started out as a writer when she discovered the players with Student Drama Society early on in university.
Engineering was just something I went to university to study. But I'd say I was there a week and I discovered players. And so quite quickly got the bug of, it was an incredible resource at the time because as students in my day, there were very few theatres in Ireland. And even though Players was a student theatre, it was treated as a sort of a semi-professional outing. In any event, it was a great stomping ground, and it was a very creative group of people. I think there just was a period of time when a community emerged out of there. I mean, most of the people I would have known in Players are still acting, writing, directing, as we all went on to do. And what was lovely about coming back to A Girl From Mogadishu was some of them, Pauline McLean, I'm thinking, and Stanley Townsend, are even in the movie. So anyway, that's how I started, originally as a writer, but in theatre, very much in theatre. There was no formal film kind of entry system in Ireland at that time.
Theatre to film does seem to be a very, very common crossover.
Yeah.
But I do think it's very different sensibilities. Can you tell me about how maybe that would impact your take on how to shoot a film?
Completely. Well, here's a funny story. The very first film I ever made was an adaptation of a play by W.B. Yeats. So I was coming from a very theatrical background, a theatre-based background. Inevitably, at simplest, as we know, theatre is a format of language, whereas film is a visual format. So it's quite a difference. But there was a long story how originally I had written the screenplay for somebody else, but after many years of getting involved in the development of it and the writing of it, and it won a number of awards and all the rest of it, and had a wonderful cast, and the director, who was earmarked to direct it, very kindly at a certain point turned around and said, I think you have an opportunity to direct your first film, you should take it. And I genuinely hadn't thought of doing it, but in any event, when I went to direct it, I was so uneducated in particularly post-production, but in filmmaking vocabulary, which was probably its saving, that I directed it like a stage play. So every scene was a developing shot. And I always remember the editor, Campan, when who came over to do it, and we didn't hire him till we finished the film. That's how we used to do things. And he said, "Oh, how many slates are there?" I said, 187. He said, "What? You sure? I think you've got that wrong." I said, No, there are 187 slates. Anyway, he came over and he said he couldn't believe it because every single scene had been shot like a developing shot, and he just had to go end to end to end to end to end. I hadn't understood the concept of coverage. I've since learned, but in any event, so it was a very unusual piece.
And do you think as well that it impacts the way that you are trying to kind of, again, cover the focus of the camera? I think, like, actors and people from theatre, I personally, just observing their work, they tend to have a great understanding of character immediately, and that kind of development and about the actual performance of the actor, as opposed to, like, this is how we capture, this is how we stage, this is the way the camera needs to move. Do you think that is the sensibility that?
I'm hearing two different questions there.
Yeah.
One, visually, yes. I mean, you do, but we learn very quickly, and we now live in a world where there is so much visual exposure that most people now could make a movie on their iPhone. So we've come an incredibly long way, and would know to turn around and do coverage and the difference between and moving shots and all those things has become much more sophisticated. So I'm not sure that visually a theatre background would impact, as long as you innately have a visual sensibility. But I do very much notice the difference between theatre training and non-theatre trained actors. I mean, that's always very obvious. It's exciting when you work with actors, to me, because that's my background, who have a foundation in theatre and are more theatre based. It is a different different approach, and it's always very exciting when you bring that onto a set. There are different dimensions.
What would that be? Would they think more about the character?
It depends on the culture. I mean, I remember Tamara Gecko coming into The Price of Desire, and her background is Serbian and Eastern European theatre, which is a very different sensibility. And you could just feel the weight of that theatrical history in every step she took and every word she uttered. So that gradually, I mean, I used to say years ago, the few of us who started together in theatre in Ireland at a time when films were starting to emerge, and we seemed to be generating maybe one male movie star per decade, starting maybe from Richard Harris, Pierce Brosnan, David Byrne, Colin Farrell, whatever. Once a decade, we had one fabulously successful, swarthy Irish male actor, and it was clear to me that there hadn't been an international breakout in film of a female Irish actor since Maureen O'Hara, and that there probably wouldn't be in my younger lifetime. Eventually, Saoirse emerged, and a whole new generation of fabulous young Irish actors have emerged. But I at that time, I put that down to a sensibility. We had a very grounded, earthy kind of theatre style. We had very strong female characters in our theatrical canon, but we had a performance style on stage that just didn't translate into what was going on for women in film at that time. And so you had these beautiful French and some strong British representation in the international female actors lists, but not Irish. And it was a performance style thing. I feel that was some would say an obstacle to others would say, well, that was our kind of performance tradition, which had more of an earthiness in it that just wasn't translating to the film performance style for women at that time. Then there's a whole bigger conversation about, well, there weren't that many roles and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. I'd love to see a PhD or a few things written up about that.
I think it's, that it's a circular thing that we mustn't forget, which is that the representation of women in front of and behind the camera, relates not just to a kind of a more systemic patriarchal thing, but that they were self-perpetuating. The lack of female writers, the lack of female roles, the lack of female directors, they were each self-perpetuating of each other.
That's true. And actually, if you look at kind of classic Irish theatre, women, you did have women roles and really interesting roles by women, but they're all as observed by the male, and very much so observed characters rather than like fully rounded. And you'd have like people bringing very interesting stuff to it, but like like when you're looking at like, to say, I don't know, like Sive or something like that, and then you have like the representation of what is good and virginal, and then you have like the naggy mom, but it is all like observed women as well, which is and how shocking in her, like even international theater, how so few women writers had their plays put on up until Wake of the Feminists.
Absolutely from the foundation of the state through to recently. But prior to that, we have a tradition that I did think it permeates somewhere. It's in our DNA, but pre and post Celtic Dawn, that we did have female writers, we did have female poets, we did have we did have in a more mythical theatre, we had female characters that represented that matriarchal DNA from Celtic culture. So we did have that in a way that other societies may not. And I do think that permeated into that performance style. There was a strength and earthiness in it in the 20th century, even though the representation of women in the modern plays that were emerging in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were incredibly derivative of our view of women at that time. But there's the Waking the Feminist didn't come from nothing. It had a cultural DNA from before the foundation of the state that it tapped into.
But it is something that you definitely like. I mean, the strong female matriarch is definitely something that we were familiar with it, even if we didn't fully understand what it meant, or it from a male perspective, it's probably quite threatening and nagging. From a female perspective, it's very empowering and interesting to look at.
It tends to be about autonomy. in drama, what we started to do when we had male perspective stories was we stopped treating women as characters like the Deirdres and Emers of our traditional theatre. They were characters in their own right who were driving narrative in the in the kind of later late 20th century, when most of our theatre, and even early 21st century, unbelievably, when most of our writing was male generated, women started, our female characters and the women we were being asked to identify with and who we didn't find reflected our beings were characters derived by association. So they were mothers, daughters, lovers of, potential romantic connections too, always by association. That's the big issue, is once writers are allowed to write characters that we produce with female directors in narratives that are driven by the female characters who have autonomy and independence, only then will we stop this kind of associative, derivative sense of womanhood.
And I think that's a perfect place to go into your very interesting work and talk about stories that interest you about strong, fabulous women. Can you tell me a little bit about, just in general, what are the type of projects that you find a connection to or that inspire you?
Well, I mean, that's always a strong issue for me, and it was something that we're all, most female filmmakers from of my generation, were always struggling to find homes for stories, and not struggling, we just simply couldn't find homes for stories that reflected the world that we hoped we would aspire to. So very often, and I was speaking to another female director friend recently about it, for about 20 years, and I kind of feel it started in the early mid 90s and went on till 5 years ago. One was having to create projects with female characters by subterfuge. So you would find yourself kind of creating storylines that had hooks rather than stories driven by characters, in order to, by dint of subterfuge, people these worlds with normal women that we could identify with and that we felt reflected our world. But as things, in the last 5 years, and Ireland was, in a way, has been a little ahead of the game, more than talking the talk, as we say, generating actual funds to develop material that is for, by, and about women. So that has been a phenomenal change, because it has been so lacking for so long. Inevitably, what's emerging are quite a number of issue-driven films. I'm sure we'll get over that. It's a kind of a compensatory period, but we'll get over that and hopefully be able to tell regular stories that just happen to be people by female characters who are real people.
It's a welcome change. I think audiences are changing as well, and are really thirsting for content that is complex and from a different perspective.
Yes, I think that the death of the rom-com is nigh. Relationship gets interesting from the end of those movies, not the beginning. So, I think you're right. I think audiences are more intelligent than perhaps financiers and distributors lead us to believe.
A Girl from Mogadishu. This is a beautiful, again, weighty film, but very inspiring. And I really want to know a bit more about the process of that getting made. Can you tell me about when you got attached to it?
For sure. So I met Ifrah through a charity that I remain associated with, which assists emerging filmmakers from third world countries. And I do very little for this charity, other than every year they do an extraordinary job bringing emerging filmmakers from third world countries. That particular year, they had East African female filmmakers who they had prepped and were bringing to Cannes to introduce to the industry. So my gig once a year was to do a kind of a workshop, to just start a workshop around pitching, basically. And at this particular event, where all these, they really didn't need a workshop from me. They were fantastic, one after the other. On a particular, just a couple of days before Cannes, one fabulous Ethiopian, Somali, or Sudanese filmmaker after another stood up to pitch their projects, which had brilliant concept videos, and they were really superb. And I hope, at any event, there was a girl sitting in the corner, dressed fabulous with this incredible headdress, and she didn't seem to stand up. So I went over to her and said, So are you going to speak? Are you one of the filmmakers? She said, no. I said, oh, where are you from? She said, Drumcondra. And then, your kind of compensatory, because we're all racist fundamentally, uh, thing kicks in. So rather than saying you don't look like you're from Drumcondra, which inevitably you kind of hesitate on that, I said, well, were you always from Drumcondra? Um, anyway, it was fun. She said, no, I have an Irish passport. Do you want to see it? I said, I don't think I need to see it with that with that accent. But in any event, so we started chatting. So it emerged. So was attending on behalf of the United Nations, and I think they were very keen, given her activism work, even to that at that stage, to see if a documentary could be made. And as it happened, they didn't seem to realise that she was quite well known in Ireland, and there'd been a number of documentaries. In any event, we were chatting, and we agreed. I still love to hear her story. I mean, the truth is, when you hear Ifrah's story, it is so compelling, and she is such a compelling person that you can't but want to amplify her voice and share what she has, the gift and the courage of her story, the fact that she tells her story to the world. I didn't know whether, I'm slightly tainted by 25 years of impossible to get films made with female characters driving the narrative, impossible to get even more impossible to get films about Irish women made, even more impossible an African Irish woman, it seemed. So the disappointment management level was quite high. So, but in any event, we thought we'd start, and she agreed to the process. So the first thing we had to do was figure out the story, and the truth was it was quite a public story because she had used it as a campaign tool for her FGM campaign over the years. But in actual fact, but without the detail that you would need for a movie, there was no book, there was no detailed script, there was nothing actually to base it on. So what she agreed to do was to sit down, and in fact we did this a couple of years ago, was it 4 years ago now, during the Galway Film Festival. And Ifrah came down, and we hid ourselves in a room in the G Hotel with two cameramen from Windmill, and she sat for 2 whole days, and we filmed. She told me her story from beginning to end. And and I suppose the structuring of the narrative came from that, because in a way, some of the detailed presentations she'd given over the years, particularly at the European Commission and other major panel events, was the detail of her story, maybe not quite in this detail. But it was a phenomenal experience and it was tough for her, and it was fantastic that she did it, but it became a phenomenal record and a phenomenal basis for the script. It also informed the structure and style of the storytelling in terms of giving her character the voice.
And was it harder to base a script on someone's actual life? Like, is it harder to go, you can't take those creative liberties, or you can, there's blanks you kind of want to fill in, but you really have to be true to the subject matter as well?
It's very restrictive. I mean, an interesting thing has happened. There's a period of time when filmmakers created films as pieces of art that were completely the consent of their imagination. Over more recent years, where marketing hooks are important, to an extent, you have a lot of male directors who are quite branded. So this is a Richard Curtis kind of film, or this is a Lars von Trier kind of film, because they have that kind of branding around them. Female filmmakers generally don't have that kind of branding. So when you go to market with stories, or when you try to pitch material, it is what we find more and more, as you probably noticed, we seem to be in the period of the based on a true story, which is limiting to an extent, but then truth is more fictional than fictional, as sometimes as emerges. But yes, to answer your question more directly, making films based on true stories is very restrictive. I've done it a few times. Each time I've said I won't do it again. And I know other filmmakers who who it is very restrictive, and you have to be incredibly sensitive. Depends on whether and sometimes in the Eileen Gray case, you're dealing with historical accuracy and estates and all of that. With somebody who's, I mean, the difficulty is, Ifrah's story is she's very young. This is not a life story. This is a period of a very young life that is already extraordinary. We were also dealing with a very sensitive issue, or a number of sensitive issues around gender-based violence, sexual violence and conflict, asylum, refugee status, gender-based violence generally, female genital mutilation. So they were all difficult subjects as well that required sensitivity. And so what I find is for each film based on a true story, you have to create your own world and your own conventions that are appropriate to the story. So once you get the conventions right, actually probably it's not that difficult.
And when it came to the act of, presumably if you can get two cameramen in a room, you already got development funding earlier on with this. Like, I mean, and it's a very human interest story anyway, so presumably you'd be silly not.
I hadn't at that point, no.
Hey,
I needed to know if there was a story. And then I remember, I felt very strongly about it. I felt that it was at that point probably an impossible thing to get off the ground. But I remember going to AFM or being in America on a different project and just generally pitching. I was pitching a different project, and the usual question is always, and do you have anything else? Which isn't a great sign, but in any event, and do you have anything else? So I started pitching the story to the extent and the reaction was incredible, and so I knew that it would that people would feel strongly about it. And I remember pitching it to the then head of the film board at the very beginning of we really want to change the direction of the film board and incentivize and work on incentivizing films for by and about women. So, well, you don't get much more for by and about women than this. And so I remember, and I think it pitched well, and I remember the reaction, often the reaction, but particularly that CEO who was extraordinarily supportive of it was horrific. I mean, terrific. I mean, horrific. So that became kind of a little eternal joke around. It was an incredible opportunity, and it felt also like an incredible responsibility to make a movie about the modern face of women in Ireland.
You notice even in our industry as well, like the stories are very much so, even if women's stories do get told, they're very leaning towards middle class women's stories or the outsider perspective observing working class women's stories. So I think just it's not representative of a population that exists in Ireland now. Like it's a new modern Ireland. I think it's important to tell those stories authentically and to get the voices of women across in the industry, because I mean that's the whole purpose of the tool of filmmaking, is to share other people's experience and to give empathy to stories maybe that people wouldn't necessarily have empathy for.
You've hit on another major issue, which is on the one side, and in the UK there's been a lot of voice given to this from actors such as Judi Dench to the institutions involved in. In fact, I think it was even Benedict Cumberbatch who said, it is terrible. You have a much better chance of becoming an actor if you're middle-class white male. So really what you're leaning into, which I think is very important, is emerging in Irish feminism and Irish and feminist culture, is the recognition of the intersectionality that we need to address. And it starts with the storytellers. So broader access to storytelling from women from all communities is key to that. And anyway,
but you get this, but this is her story, and it's told very authentically, and it's a beautiful story, and it's very important that it is told. I think for that.
Yes, but you are right. It isn't Ifrah Ifrah didn't make the movie.
Yeah.
But what I tried to do, what I tried to facilitate was to genuinely step back as the filmmaker and allow the voice to emerge and tell the story from her point of view.
But do you really get that sense that that's definitely there throughout the whole thing? I feel like I'm watching her tell that story, and I can see it, even the choice of the way things are there, and I think that's very important. And I just wondered as well, was there any politics? Because you are dealing with things that are active at the moment, and it's quite positive, like, and everything in there's a lot about the film, and I know it's an uplifting, inspiring story, but I'm just wondering, did you come up against any politics there? Because it's Ireland for refugees isn't necessarily the most friendliest place immediately all the time. Was there any kind of stories that you were like, okay, well, or is it more like a conscious choice where that's not the story you were trying to tell?
One of the things that we were very conscious of is, if we were making a documentary, then certain issues would have probably been dealt with differently, and may have been more politically sensitive. This is a dramatic feature, narrative feature, so it's a character story, and certain licenses absolutely and undoubtedly were taken. And one of the most difficult to see, it is such there are so many issues that emerge in the film, that the one that I'm very conscious of, that we chose, there were, I suppose, the two main areas in Ireland that we chose not to get into because we just couldn't, and because they weren't Ifrah's experience, and Ifrah's experience is quite unique. Ifrah's experience, because she arrived in Ireland as a minor, was not the same. It was not a typical asylum seeker's experience, and and that is a story for another day, and it would be an important story. So I completely appreciate that some people are looking, going, but surely, what about direct provision, and how difficult it is, and her times in Ireland were.
Ireland isn't always the most welcoming place.
And Ifrah would have to speak to that herself. Yeah. And any immigrant I've ever met in Ireland, I don't know, I haven't come across an immigrant person who hasn't experienced some level of racism in Ireland. But that was not the film we were making. And we were making a film based on a character who tries to see the positive in everything, and who is deeply appreciative of her adopted country. And so that's the story we were telling. And there were more than enough issues around the gender-based violence of it all, that at a certain point you have to think about your audience. Yeah. And I don't think the film, or certainly Ifrah's story, lacks authenticity in that regard, because that is the nature of the character whose story we were telling. But I'm very conscious that it was a whole set of other issues that we couldn't and didn't address in this film. And there are 90 minutes to tell already what is an involved story around the very serious gender-based violence issues that emerge in it.
Yeah, and that's just my thing. Was there any pushback, or was there any influence to change that? But actually, that answers it, that it is from her perspective, and she's very positive about it, which again, I suppose, is a testament to her as a human being able to carry that and to be a spokesperson for it. Because, like, you could just see it's such a heavy thing. It'd be very easy to be crushed under the weight of it. And that is that positivity and strength that kind of pushes her through, which makes her just an amazing person to watch her story for so long, through like a feature, and it's so inspiring. Would you ever be tempted to kind of like stretch this out, or like, again, it would be something fabulous for Netflix, or that kind of narrative is very interesting now, especially given the climate and how things are shifting back in so many other countries at the moment. Would it be something you ever thought of fictionalizing so that you could serialize it or anything like that?
Well, this story, I feel we've really told, and as a piece of impact culture, it's having an effect. But I agree with you that we're at a time and in a place in the kind of the global feminist wave where rollback is an issue, and it's shocking in my lifetime that is happening. So it behoves those of us who have an opportunity to do so to re-examine and re-explore issues of, in a general sense, human justice, but gender issues that are in any way being subjected to a level of rollback that might mitigate against basic autonomy and independence and human rights. So yes, there are so many issues we can be dealing with. There are many. I am working on a series with a writers team at the moment, which I'm very excited about, which does address a completely different gender-based violence issue. And we do find that there is more than enough material to complexly fill 10 episodes. It was a real challenge, but great fun to try to encompass Ifrah's story in a way in the 90-minute format, with and try, the most difficult thing, I suppose, in a way for me as a writer, was to find a way to give voice to a story that would be told sensitively, that would not objectify or traumatize, but at the same time respectfully represent the issue, and be uh, more than a holler from the rooftops, but actually have some kind of universal theme that warranted cinematic treatment. And so, in a way, we were talking about giving voice to Ifrah and her testimony, but really, what I always feel, for me, every film has to have an underlying thesis about which I am passionate enough to spend the time, energy, effort, and hassle and harassment that goes into making a movie to make it worthwhile. So, for me, the theme that emerged and that really underpinned this story was the power of testimony. And Ifrah as a character is a phenomenal example of that thesis. What one voice that has the courage to speak up and tell her truth can achieve by telling her story. And that's a fundamental cultural concept, telling stories and the power of that testimony.
And it's truly beautiful. And again, like she really is just such an amazing figure. But I want to go to so much I want to ask you about, but we don't have time, unfortunately. But I do
go down.
yeah. But I want to touch very, very quickly about filming the scenes scenes that were set in Somalia.
Yes.
Where were they shot?
Oh yes. They were shot. So that was always going to be different. You write your script and you think, don't be confined by how difficult this is going to be. So just tell the story. And then you slowly migrate, once the script gets to a place, into the practicalities of how to direct and make this movie. And of course, I had written war scenes in Somalia and rooftops and I don't know, all sorts of crikey, how are we going to get the budget to do this? In any event, so you do a bit of research. There have been a number of films set in Somalia. Most of them were shot in Morocco. You can't go to Somalia to shoot for obvious reasons. Most of them were set in Morocco, very often shot, starting with Captain Phillips, which Barkat Abdi, one of our actors, starred in, emerged in. Very cheap location rankings, basically. What I was very conscious of, and this was part of Ifrah's gift to the film, was the cultural authenticity. And the one of the great gifts of this film has been an introduction to a world and people I did not know. And Somali people are so like, there's a terrible, it's a line in the film, and I just put it in because there's a line in the film where apparently famously Richard, I've forgotten his name now, described the Somali people as the Irish of Africa to the British government. And there's horrific as the statement was intended to be at the time. There's some truth to it. Very culturally similar. Great humor. They understand what slagging is. Great spirit, general. Anyway, phenomenal. So one of the issues every Somali person I met before we made the film wanted to make sure that I understood was that there had not been a film that they'd ever seen set in Somalia that looked like it was set in Somalia. And there were a number of giveaways. And a particular giveaway is graffiti with Arabic writing. Somali is not Arabic, it's a different language. There were other giveaways. Anyway, so I was determined to try to break this issue. So a lot of films have shot around Rabat and Casablanca, and anyway, we started there. And anyway, it's usual. It's much easier to location recce these days, and there's a very good industry in Morocco, and we had co-producers there who were phenomenal actually. So we found a lot of films go to much bigger cities, but because we were small, we could move to more difficult locations. So we went to the little town of Aswira, and we were able, just by spending a lot of time, it's all about prep. Location recce's and spending a lot of time figuring out how, in a very tight schedule with a very tight budget, we could make these scenes happen. And anyway, we were very, very lucky with the location. I have a great designer who I've worked with a number of times, as sticky and rigorous as I am around prepping and locations and design and all of that.
Brilliant. And it's stunning. And then finally, how has it been getting this screened now with everything that's happening?
Oh, so the great sadness was, it's hard to put the foresight about women films that are now getting made still struggle with a kind of a patriarchal run distribution system that doesn't, that combined with the actual state of the industry was difficult enough until everything fell off a cliff with COVID.
I was looking forward to catching this at a Callus, like in March.
Yes, exactly. So we had months of prep, and it was a very well organized campaign through the US festivals in the autumn. Anyway, we got as far as International Women's Day, which was the Belgian premiere, I remember, which I think was the 8th of March. Well, it would have been, that's International Women's Day. And the Irish release, we were kind of lucky that it was 3 or 4 weeks out, not 1 or 2 weeks when COVID hit. So who knew then? Everything just got cancelled. And in the end, and this, as we know, has gone on for months, and I'm not complaining because there are much bigger issues at stake. But it's been interesting watching the different distributors in different countries innovate around it. So in the end, in America, that quite early on, they were of a view that cinemas would not open for a long time. And so they skipped cinemas and went straight to Showtime. So the film actually ended up being released on Showtime in July. And then the UK Irish distributors in fact, we've ended up innovating something with much more impact, I hope, with this campaign across the 16 days of activism. So what was a premiere in the Lighthouse is now a global virtual premiere with a panel with the Irish ambassador Geraldine Byrne-Nason interviewing Natalia Kanem from the UNFPA and all these different stakeholders internationally. And they're running these virtual events with Ifrah Foundation from West America, East Coast America, UK, Ireland, I think on Wednesday, through the 16 days, Europe, East Africa, West Africa, and ending up in Somalia. So that's a very exciting thing to have innovated. I don't think that would have happened pre-COVID. And then our distributors are becoming incredibly flexible. So they will release the film on December 4th, however and where they can.
Brilliant. And we'll make sure to include all links in the bio for this. So click in. So we'll definitely give that a big holler.
Brilliant. So as I understand it, if the cinema's open in the IFI, you can go into the IFI. If it's not, you can go to the IFI website. Same with the Lighthouse and Palace and all the different cinemas. So finally, we're all innovating and watching movies at home. There will be cinema experiences in the future, we hope. But for now, we'd like people to be able to see the film.
Yeah, so something beautiful, positive, and nourishing is what I'd like to describe the film. But thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you very much, Gemma. It's been a pleasure. Really a pleasure. Great line of questioning.